Welcome back to another Explainer, folks. Today, we are diving into the fascinating and honestly sometimes cutthroat world of organizational strategy and adaptation. Okay, let's dive into this.
So here's a pretty provocative question for you. Why do some massive, globally recognized companies survive for a whole century, while others seemingly just vanish overnight? Seriously, think about the business landscape today. It's constantly shifting right under our feet. Consumer preferences completely change, new tech disrupts old industries, and global economies bounce around. The ever-present threat to any company out there is organizational inertia. Basically, getting stuck in your old habits while the rest of the external environment just races right by you.
So, to break this all down, here's our agenda for today's Explainer. First, we'll look at the necessity of change. Second, the different frameworks of change management. Third, we are taking a deep dive into evolutionary change. Fourth, we'll look at the mechanics of evolution. And finally, we will wrap up with something called punctuated equilibrium.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the necessity of change. Essentially, adapt or go obsolete.
In today's hyper-competitive world, industry life cycles are getting drastically shorter. Standing still? Yeah, that just isn't an option anymore. So, to handle this constant pressure, companies rely heavily on change management. Our sources define this as the structured process of implementing operational, technological, strategic, or even mission changes to deal with external conditions and actually achieve a desired outcome. It's really a form of management control that uses systematic interventions. Simply put, you can't just cross your fingers and hope for the best. You absolutely have to plan for the shift.
And at its core, the mission of change management is ultimately all about the people. It's actually a staggering fact that 70% of change initiatives fail. Why? Because this human element is completely ignored. Proactive change management minimizes all that anxiety and ensures that employees don't just, survive the transition, but that they actively adopt it and really thrive in their everyday work.
Moving right along to Section 2, the frameworks of change management, the three overarching types.
So our source material points to three primary overarching types of organizational change. Now, while there are a ton of little subsets, the three big pillars we are going to focus on are evolutionary change, revolutionary change, and directed, which is sometimes called planned change. Let's contrast those first two for a second. Evolutionary change is all about step-by-step gradual adjustments. It's basically an organization quietly and continuously responding to its changing environment. Now, on the flip side, we have revolutionary change. This is typically forced upon an organization by massive external power shifts. Think of things like aggressive mergers and acquisitions or hostile takeovers. It's sudden, it's sweeping, and honestly, it can be pretty violent in a corporate sense.
And then the third primary framework is directed change. This one is a highly deliberate, really purpose-driven approach where leadership and the workforce actively work together to align the company's culture with new structures and processes. This umbrella actually houses subtypes you've probably heard of, like transitional and transformational change, where an organization literally visualizes a totally new destination and then carefully orchestrates the journey to get there.
All right, Section 3. This is our deep dive into evolutionary change. Small steps, massive impact. This is really the core focus of today's Explainer. Understanding evolutionary change within that much larger context of change management we just talked about.
If you look at the top left quadrant of this matrix from our sources, you'll see evolution is plotted right where the speed of change is incremental, but the extent of change is transformation. What this tells us is that evolutionary change is highly proactive. It's undertaken in anticipation of future needs, and it's implemented gradually through a bunch of interrelated initiatives. So no, it doesn't happen overnight, but its ultimate goal is a total, ground-up transformation of the organization.
Honestly, the absolute best way to think about this is through the lens of biological evolution. In nature, a species doesn't just change its entire physical structure in a single generation, right? It relies on tiny, almost invisible daily adjustments. In a business, these small, step-by-step changes might seem completely insignificant today. But man, when you look back after 5 or 10 years, those compounded adjustments have resulted in a massively transformed, highly competitive organization. It's like a giant puzzle coming together one single piece at a time.
Which brings us to Section 4, the mechanics of evolution. How capabilities actually develop. Our sources draw on this really cool concept called evolutionary economics, which basically applies biological concepts variation, selection, and retention directly to corporate routines. First up, variation. This is where the firm actively searches for new organizational routines and fresh ways of doing things. Next is selection. Here, the firm acts as a ruthless filter. Think corporate natural selection, quickly abandoning the routines that just fail. And finally, retention. The firm takes the routines that actually do work and replicates them across the entire organization. This cycle, repeated over and over and over again, is exactly how a company evolves.
But I got to tell you, there is a massive danger here. I want you to really think about this question. Have your company's core capabilities become core rigidities? Evolutionary economists warn us about something called the competency trap. This happens when an organization becomes so incredibly good at a specific routine, so highly developed in just one way of working, that it becomes physically and culturally unable to develop new routines. The very thing that made them great? Yeah, it literally becomes the anchor that drags them down when the environment inevitably changes.
So how do we fix that? Well, to break out of those competency traps, managers often use Lewin's change model. It's a foundational 3-step process to safely dismantle and then rebuild those deeply ingrained habits. Step 1 is unfreezing, basically breaking down the current status quo and the attitudes that lock it all in place. Step 2 is adjustment, which is sometimes called moving or changing. This is where the actual new system is tinkered with and implemented. And step 3 is refreezing, stabilizing that new balance and locking the new behaviors in place with updated policies and rewards.
All right, our final section, number 5, punctuated equilibrium, the timeline of a company.
Let's zoom out for a second and look at the broader timeline of a company's entire life cycle. Organizations don't usually experience chaos all the time, right? According to the source material, most large organizations follow a particular strategic orientation for about 15 to 20 years. This phenomenon is called punctuated equilibrium. You have a really long period of stability where a company is just doing that quiet, evolutionary fine-tuning we just talked about. But eventually, this long, calm equilibrium is violently punctuated by a short burst of revolutionary fundamental change. It's a massive shock to the system that forces management to totally reassess their direction.
A perfect example of this from our sources is the Liz Claiborne story. Back in the 1980s, Liz Claiborne was a wildly successful clothing brand. They evolved a very tight-fitting business system. I mean, they had a color-by-numbers design approach, super strict 6-season product cycles, and rigid rules that literally forced retailers to buy entire collections at once without any reordering. It was a beautiful, highly stable evolutionary peak for them. But then, the 1990s hit, and the environment totally changed. Casual wear became the new big thing, and financial pressures meant department stores wanted to order in smaller, much more frequent batches. Well, Liz Claiborne's tightly linked system completely broke down. They just couldn't adapt to the new fast cycle model. The environment demanded a revolution, and their evolutionary rigidities almost destroyed the entire brand until a new CEO came in and systematically rebuilt the whole business.
You know, this entire explainer really comes down to this famous idea often attributed to Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. Whether you are a tiny biological organism or a massive multinational corporation, your ultimate metric for success is, without a doubt, your agility.
And I'll leave you with this fantastic quote highlighted in our source material from a 1966 song. You keep saying when you ought to be changing. So look at your own organization, your own department, or hey, even your own daily routines. Are you stuck in a competency trap? Are you just saying? Or are you actively, intentionally evolving? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, folks. I'll catch you next time.